Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for an unprecedented look into these colossal leaks of financial secrets, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and of course, the Pandora Papers.
And these weren't just big news stories, were they? They were a systemic shock.
A huge shock. They exposed the true staggering size of the global shadow economy.
Exactly. And we're not just reciting headlines here. For this, we're using a whole stack of primary source material. We've got investigative reports from the ICIJ, detailed academic critiques, and the actual policy documents from the regulatory counteroffensive that followed.
Right. And our mission today is to take you through the anatomy of that financial secrecy and then explain the high-stakes, high-impact policy response that came after.
Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the European Union's sixth anti-money laundering directive. You'll see it called 6-AMLD.
And that directive, it completely redefined criminal liability across the entire continent. It was a huge deal.
A massive deal. And if we focus just on the Panama Papers to start, the sheer scale is the first thing you have to wrap your head around. I mean, we are talking about 11.5 million leaked documents.
It's an incredible number.
It's 2.6 terabytes of data. And this data detailed the financial maneuvers of over 214,000 offshore entities.
It exposed what the ICIJ called, and I think this is the perfect term, the inner workings of a shadow economy that benefits the wealthy and well-connected at the expense of everyone else.
That's it in a nutshell.
So that brings us to our core question for this deep dive. When a secret system is exposed on this scale, how does that fundamentally alter the global game?
Right. How did the existence of these mechanisms force a regulatory body like the EU to, well, drop the hammer?
And what specific fixes like 6-AMLD were put in place to try and repair this, I guess, completely fractured financial system? Let's unpack this.
So to start at the beginning of the biggest leak, we have to look at Mossack Fonseca.
MF, as they're known.
MF, yes. This is a Panamanian law firm run by German-born lawyer Jürgen Mossack and a Panamanian lawyer, Ramon Fonseca. And they were operating for decades, right at the heart of this offshore system.
They were, until their exposure, they were one of the world's largest providers of these offshore corporate services.
They were huge. And their stated business model was, on the surface, pretty straightforward.
What was it?
Just incorporating and operating shell companies in what they called friendly jurisdictions.
Places we've all heard of, the British Virgin Islands, Panama itself, the Seychelles.
Exactly. Places renowned for their financial secrecy laws.
But the internal documents, they tell a very, very different story about their real purpose, don't they?
Oh, completely. The sources include this absolutely critical quote from an internal MF memorandum that it cuts straight to the point.
What does it say?
It says, 95% of our work coincidentally consists in selling vehicles to avoid taxes.
Coincidentally.
Coincidentally.
Yeah.
So they weren't just facilitating legal corporate structures. They were explicitly marketing tax avoidance strategies on a massive industrial scale.
Okay, so let's define the key tools they were selling. First up, the shell company. For you, the listener, who might only know this term from movies, what exactly is it, and what does it actually do?
A shell company is essentially a legal entity that exists only on paper.
Okay, no real activity.
None. No operational activity, no employees, no physical office. Its sole purpose is typically to hold assets or transfer money or maintain bank accounts.
And almost always in a secrecy jurisdiction?
Almost always, yes. Somewhere that requires minimal public disclosure. And the cost of setting one up was surprisingly low.
How low are we talking?
Sometimes just a few $100s, which made them accessible to a huge range of individuals and corporations seeking to, minimize their footprint.
And then there's the other layer of protection that really guaranteed the anonymity, the nominee structure.
Right, and this is where the system really shifted from just, say, tax optimization into outright secrecy facilitation.
How did that work?
If a client wanted absolute anonymity, they could pay MF an extra fee to provide nominees.
And these are just front people.
Just front people, yeah. They would legally act as the registered shareholders, the directors, or, and this is the critical part, the beneficial owners.
And the beneficial owner, that's the key term we need to understand. That's the real person who actually owns, profits from, or controls the company, no matter whose name is on the paperwork.
Precisely. And the act of providing a nominee beneficial owner, specifically to mask the true controller's identity, that is illegal in pretty much every legitimate jurisdiction that's trying to adhere to anti-money laundering or AML standards.
So it's a deliberate act of obfuscation.
It's a deliberate effort to create an opaque paper trail, one designed to defeat authorities investigating crime or tax evasion.
And beyond just setting up these shells, MF offered premium tailor-made services. These were designed to completely obscure where money was coming from and where it was going.
This really showed how deeply embedded they were in the actual movement of money.
What was one of those services?
They had one called Mossfon Escrow. Imagine a client with money they need to move discreetly, money whose origin might be, let's say, questionable.
Okay.
They could deposit this money into an MF Trust escrow account. The trust would then send the money onward to its final destination.
But the paper trail would show the money coming from where?
It would show the money coming from Mossack Fonseca Trust. It completely masked the original client. The firm's name was essentially being used as a temporary laundering service.
And the sources provide some pretty compelling evidence of the sort of clientele this attracted. You mentioned a really disturbing anecdote about an Australian client.
Yes. The files reveal a case where an Australian client, literally immediately after being released from prison for serving time on 66 counts of fraud,
66 counts.
contacted Mossack Fonseca directly to request one of these specialized escrow accounts.
So the firm was clearly attracting the most criminally inclined individuals, people who needed rapid, untraceable service.
Exactly. This wasn't about cautious estate planning anymore. This was about cleaning up funds after a crime.
The incredible irony here is that this entire meticulously constructed global network of secrecy didn't come down because of some massive police sting or a coordinated government effort.
Not at all.
It came down because of profound, almost amateur-level technological failure.
That's the shocking part, isn't it? The fragility of a system built on total confidence. The leak source, who we only know as John Doe, reached out to the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung.
And their motivation.
They said it was motivated by concerns over escalating global income inequality. Doe insisted on using encrypted channels, obviously understanding the danger involved.
So what did the cybersecurity experts find when they finally looked at Mossack Fonseca's systems? It wasn't some sophisticated state-sponsored espionage attack.
No, it was just profound negligence. The list of security failings is honestly astonishing, especially for a firm that relied entirely on absolute confidentiality.
Give us some examples.
Okay, so MF was running versions of Drupal that were 3 years old and contained known public vulnerabilities.
That's basic stuff.
Basic. They weren't encrypting client emails. They used an outdated version of a standard WordPress plugin, Slider Revolution. I mean, these are the equivalent of leaving the front door wide open while you're storing state secrets inside.
And you mentioned something quite technical earlier, the failure to segment the network. What does that mean?
It really reveals their priorities. They prioritize secrecy over security. Their network architecture was basically non-existent. The email and web servers were not segmented, meaning separated from the core client database.
So once a hacker was in one part, they had access to everything.
Everything. Once you're in the web server, you have a direct line to the entire client history. And get this, security analysts discovered that Mossack Fonseca's client login portal was even running 4 different government-grade remote access Trojans, RTs.
Okay, let's define that for the listener. What is a RT?
A R8, a remote access Trojan, is malicious software. It allows a hacker to control the infected computer remotely, often without the user ever knowing.
So they can steal data, log keystrokes.
They can essentially have full visibility into the network. For a firm like MF, that should have been an absolute immediate red flag. The fact that multiple RATs were running suggests a complete failure of internal IT oversight.
They were so focused on hiding their clients from government.
But they failed to protect their clients' data from hackers.
Now, it's an important distinction to reiterate that while the firm facilitated massive illegality, the vehicle itself, the offshore entity, isn't inherently criminal.
That's crucial for context, yes. Offshore entities are legally used for things like complex international estate planning or avoiding legitimate double taxation.
Or, as the sources mentioned, Stanley Kubrick's estate used one to manage assets between the UK and the US.
Exactly. There are legitimate uses.
But where does the line get crossed, based on the reporting?
It's crossed when they are misused for the 4 major criminal categories uncovered by the reporters: fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and critically evading international sanctions.
And the source documents showed that MF often knew about, or at least ignored, clear red flags. They offered to backdate documents.
For a fee, yes. which meant falsifying the paper trail to make it appear that a beneficial owner was appointed much earlier than they actually were.
And the due diligence failures were just blatant breaches of AML rules.
The due diligence was a farce, really. There was one instance where they hired a 90-year-old British man to pretend to be the owner of a U.S. businesswoman's offshore company.
A 90-year-old proxy owner.
It's a classic blatant breach of international AML rules. The whole system was designed not to comply, but to profit from non-compliance.
So what we have is a catastrophic data leak exposing a firm built on legal technicalities but operating with criminal intent, all facilitated by shocking security negligence.
And that provided the flashpoint for a global political explosion.
The moment the Panama Papers hit the public domain, the fallout was immediate and visceral, wasn't it? Particularly in countries where political stability relies heavily on public trust.
Absolutely. And the sources show the most dramatic political reaction happened in Iceland.
Tell us that story of Prime Minister Sigmundur David Gunnlaugsson.
Gunnlaugsson's case became the poster child for political hypocrisy. He resigned just hours after the revelations were made public.
What was revealed?
He and his wife secretly owned an offshore company, Wintris Inc., which held millions of dollars in bonds in the three major Icelandic banks that had collapsed during the 2008 financial crisis.
The conflict of interest is just staggering. I mean, he was elected on a platform promising to be tough on foreign creditors who held stakes in the collapsed banks.
Yet he was secretly one of those very creditors. The sources confirmed he had failed to disclose his 50% ownership when he entered Parliament in 2009.
And the public reaction?
Instant outrage. Thousands gathered outside the Parliament building in Reykjavik, demanding his resignation. It just shows how quickly financial secrecy can completely erode a legitimate democratic mandate.
And the leaks, of course, they touched every corner of the globe. They named 12 current or former world leaders, along with 128 other high-profile public officials.
We saw high-profile figures implicated everywhere, from Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko, who was a direct client, to family members and close associates of powerful figures in Russia, like Vladimir Putin, and China's Xi Jinping.
And in Argentina?
In Argentina, President Mauricio Macri faced an investigation after it was revealed he failed to declare his directorship of a Bahamas-based company called Flag Trading Ltd. As an asset.
But for Western governments and intelligence agencies, the concern went beyond just tax evasion and political embarrassment. It was about how these structures were actively undermining national security and foreign policy goals, specifically through sanctions evasion.
And this is where the cost of secrecy becomes measured in human lives and global instability. More than 30 MF clients were blacklisted by the U.S. Treasury Department at some point.
The Syrian case is horrifying. Detail that connection for us. How were Mossack Fonseca's services used to fuel the conflict in Syria?
We found three specific companies: Maximum Middle East Trading, Morgan Additives Manufacturing, and Pangates International. All of them used MF to set up shell companies in the Seychelles.
And their purpose?
Their entire purpose was to evade crippling international sanctions placed against the Syrian government during the civil war. Pangates, in particular, was accused of supplying specialty petroleum products to the Assad regime.
One of the investigative journalists, Frederick Obermeyer, painted a very stark picture here. He said the sleek, modern methods of moving money through tax havens were funding the most horrific, pre-modern acts of violence.
Like dropping barrel bombs on civilian populations. It connects the world of white-collar crime directly to violent conflict. The financial secrecy MF provided allowed the Assad regime, through its intermediaries, to bypass critical economic pressure and secure necessary supplies.
And the firm was aware of this risk, yet it continued facilitating the business.
They were. One of their most notorious clients was Rami Makhlouf, a cousin of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, who had been under U.S. sanctions since 2008.
So they knew he was a sanctioned individual.
They knew. And despite their own compliance teams repeatedly recommending that MF terminate the relationship due to the severe political risk, MF continued to run 6 businesses for him for months.
And it wasn't just them. The sources also suggested other major financial institutions like HSBC seemed comfortable with him as a client.
Which suggests a broader complacency in the banking sector toward politically sanctioned individuals at the time.
And Syria wasn't an isolated case. The papers also revealed structures supporting North Korea's illegal weapons proliferation.
That's right. MF ran companies linked to a North Korean banker, Kim Chalsom, and a British banker, Nigel Cowie.
And what was the structure?
They used a Virgin Islands-based shell called DCB Finance as a front for Daedong Credit Bank. This structure was designed to provide banking services to notorious North Korean arms dealers, specifically the Korea Mining and Development Trading Corporation.
Which was trying to evade sanctions aimed at curbing Pyongyang's nuclear program.
Exactly. These shell companies were the financial lubricant for global proliferation threats.
So the immediate political turmoil eventually subsided, but the pressure then shifted to accountability. Did this massive leak actually translate into hard legal and financial recovery?
It absolutely did, and the numbers are substantial.
Sure.
The sources show that by April 2021, so 5 years after the initial publication, governments globally had officially recouped more than $1.36 billion.
Wow.
$1.36 billion in back taxes and penalties directly attributable to evidence found in the Panama Papers.
That is a staggering figure, but it's crucial for you to understand why even that massive number is actually a huge understatement of the total impact.
It is extremely conservative. First, that figure only includes funds officially acknowledged by governments as being directly recovered from the Panama Papers investigation.
So it doesn't include the Paradise or Pandora Papers.
Nope. Second, several countries like Japan, which reportedly collected over 3 billion yen, choose not to publicize specific recovery numbers because of ongoing cases.
Right. Case sensitivity.
And third, it doesn't account for the massive deterrent effect. The taxes paid voluntarily by people who saw the leaks and, frankly, got scared they were next.
So which nations led these recovery efforts?
The top recovering nations confirmed by 2021 were the UK, which recouped about $252 million, Germany, with almost $196 million, Spain, with $166 million, and France, with $142 million.
Even smaller nations got in on it.
Oh, yeah. Norway reported nearly $34 million in newly recovered revenue. This just demonstrates that transparency pays back in massive public revenue.
And accountability wasn't just financial. There were criminal convictions.
Yes, particularly in the U.S. The leaks led directly to federal prison sentences. An accountant named Richard Gaffey pleaded guilty and was sentenced to over 3 years for conspiracy to commit tax evasion and defraud the U.S.
And his client?
His client, Harold Joachim von der Goltz, received a 4-year sentence for wire fraud, tax fraud, and money laundering. And these convictions were crucial because they established that the U.S. Department of Justice could successfully prosecute individuals based on data extracted from these leaks.
So what happened to the firm that caused all this damage? Mossack Fonseca itself.
Well, after facing massive global scrutiny, raids in multiple countries, and over 150 official inquiries by the end of 2016, Panama's Attorney General publicly labeled MF a criminal organization.
And they shut down.
They shut their doors for good in March 2018. The global consensus was that the supply-side infrastructure for secrecy had suffered a devastating blow.
But here's the twist that really undermines the whole narrative of justice. The founders, Jürgen Mossack and Ramon Fonseca, who were briefly jailed, were ultimately acquitted.
Or acquitted of money laundering charges by a Panamanian judge in June of 2024.
So what does that acquittal signal to the global financial community and to those of us who are pursuing transparency?
It signals two things, I think. First, the enormous difficulty in prosecuting these complex cross-border financial crimes, even with 11.5 million documents. Legal systems are still siloed and they're slow.
And the second thing.
And more importantly, it shows that while the immediate damage to the brand of secrecy providers was successful, the ultimate message sent to future professional enablers is mixed. The system that allowed the money to flow still has gaps big enough for the architects to walk right through.
The political and legal fallout is one layer, but the deeper dive into the source material really shows that the Panama Papers were fundamentally about a profound systemic injustice.
Right.
It was about inequality, which, as the anonymous leaker John Doe stated, is one of the defining issues of our time.
That's the critical takeaway. The leaks didn't just expose individual corruption. They revealed a system that was structurally designed to allow the wealthy elite to shield their assets from taxation.
Which effectively forces governments to rely on public debt or regressive taxes, and it starves public services.
Exactly. And the devastating effect this has on the global south, particularly Africa, often goes underreported compared to scandals involving European politicians.
The statistics are horrifying.
They are. The African continent annually loses up to $50 billion due to illicit financial flows, or IFF.
$50 billion a year.
To give that some meaning, one source noted that $50 billion translates to an hourly loss of 47 million Norwegian krone. That's enough money to pay for 1 year of education for 41,000 children.
Wow.
These IFFs drain capital that is desperately needed for development and infrastructure.
And this loss contributes directly to massive wealth concentration, right?
Absolutely. The sources cite a study in Kenya showing that roughly two-thirds of the country's $50 billion economy is held by an extremely small elite.
How small?
Just 8,300 super wealthy individuals. That level of concentration, fueled by tax avoidance, is a direct threat to democratic stability and poverty eradication efforts.
And here is the fact that completely reverses the typical narrative of dependency we hear about Africa. This is the moment we really need to pause and just grasp the true scale of the wealth hidden offshore.
This data point is explosive. Estimates show that between 1970 and 2008, 38 African countries accumulated $1.3 trillion offshore.
1.3 trillion.
Now, compare that to their external debt stock, which stood at $283 billion. This means Africa's hidden private wealth exceeds its public external debt by a ratio of 4 to 1.
4 to 1. So despite the global perception, Africa is collectively a net creditor to the world.
It is. But that money is simply held offshore, unavailable for public investment or debt repayment. It's wealth that belongs to the continent but is hidden away in other countries' financial systems.
It just flips the script entirely.
It proves that the problem isn't a lack of wealth. It's a failure of enforcement and a system that prioritizes secrecy over repatriation.
And if we look at the source of these IFFs, that $50 billion lost every year, what's the primary culprit? Is it the classic image of a corrupt dictator stashing gold?
That's the common belief, but the data is clear. Corruption by state officials accounts for only about 5% of IFFs.
Only 5%.
The overwhelming majority, a massive 65%, is tax dodging resulting from the manipulation of commercial transactions by multinational corporations.
And this is where we have to delve deeper into the distinction between tax evasion and tax avoidance, because of that 65% falls predominantly into the second legal category.
Okay, let's clarify that for the listener. Tax evasion is strictly illegal. Underreporting income, setting up fraudulent shells that actively lie to tax authorities.
Tax avoidance, on the other hand,
Is the manipulation of tax laws using complex legal structures to reduce or eliminate tax liability.
Can you give us a concrete example of how large multinational corporations engage in this legal avoidance? It's often called aggressive tax planning.
The prime example is through a mechanism called transfer pricing. Imagine a massive tech company with subsidiaries in the UK and, say, Luxembourg.
Okay.
The UK subsidiary sells products, generating revenue. The Luxembourg subsidiary owns the intellectual property, the patents, the trademarks. To minimize tax in the high-tax UK, the UK subsidiary pays massive royalties to the Luxembourg IP subsidiary for the right to use those patents.
So the profit just vanishes from the UK, where the actual sales are happening, and it reappears in Luxembourg, where the corporate tax rates are often much, much lower.
Exactly. And because this movement of money, the payment of these internal royalties, is done between two parts of the same company, they can price the transfer extremely aggressively, often making the UK subsidiary appear barely profitable.
So it's technically legal.
Technically legal, but it results in tax revenues being siphoned away from where the economic activity truly occurs. This is the legal rot that drives 65% of IFFs.
And this brings us back to the architects of the system, the professional enablers.
They are the essential link. As one economist noted, the true honor for creating this systemic flaw goes to the lawyers, the bankers, and the accountants, the supply-side infrastructure for IFFs.
They devise the legal ways for the rich and famous to hide wealth, often using the technical legality of avoidance to mock the idea that everyone must pay their fair share.
They do, and the Panama Papers were only the tip of the iceberg, right? Because once the heat was on Panama, the business simply moved.
Correct. The shell company vehicle is still the preferred tool globally, but the leaks accelerated a worrying trend, the rise of onshore secrecy.
So when jurisdictions like Panama face intense scrutiny, wealth doesn't just evaporate, it moves to the next safe, secretive harbor.
And those new harbors aren't just small island nations anymore.
No. The Financial Secrecy Index shows that the worst culprits for financial secrecy are increasingly wealthy nations. We call them onshore tax havens: Switzerland, Luxembourg, and notably the United States. Yes. Within the U.S., states like Delaware, Wyoming, and South Dakota have become enormously popular secrecy jurisdictions because they allow for the creation of trusts and anonymous LLCs with minimal disclosure requirements.
That's a powerful insight. The leaks didn't end the secrecy game. They simply forced the players to move the game from the tropics to high-end financial centers.
which confirms the enormous difficulty in fighting a practice that has such strong roots in otherwise legitimate legal systems.
And that's exactly why the regulatory response had to be so aggressive.
The exposure of the Panama Papers, combined with all these continuous high-profile European banking scandals, like the massive money laundering operations at Danske Bank, it created an undeniable political and economic urgency for the EU to act, and act decisively.
And the primary problem they were trying to solve was the patchwork approach across the 27 member states.
That patchwork was being exploited systematically.
Right.
Imagine that money laundering was a crime defined slightly differently in Italy than in Germany, and the penalties were wildly different.
Criminal organizations would just shop around.
They deliberately tailor their laundering strategies to take advantage of the most lenient jurisdiction. The lack of harmonization allowed criminals to find the easiest place to clean their funds.
And this necessitated the sixth anti-money laundering directive, 6 AMLD. What was its overarching goal beyond just closing specific loopholes?
6 AMLD's goal was to create a robust, stringent, and most importantly, harmonized money laundering offense across the entire European Union. It wasn't about adding another layer. It was about solidifying the foundation of the entire AML regime.
And the timeline was tight.
Very tight. The EU mandated that member states transpose the directive into national laws by December 3, 2020, with businesses facing a compliance deadline of June 2021. That tight schedule really shows the political will behind it.
Okay, let's break down the key legal changes, starting with that foundation of harmonization.
First, the directive enforces consistency in the definition of money laundering offenses. Before, minor variations meant that a prosecutor in one country might struggle to charge a crime that happened in another. Now, the definition of what constitutes a money laundering offense is consistent, which makes cross-border investigations and prosecutions dramatically easier.
And then we get to accountability. We talked about professional enablers being the true systemic flaw. How did 6 AMLD specifically target them?
This is perhaps the most consequential shift. Aiding and abetting money laundering becomes a common, explicit, and uniformly defined offense across the entire EU.
So the focus is now fiercely aimed at the professional collaborators.
The bankers, the investment managers, the lawyers, the accountants who devise and execute these schemes, yes.
What does that mean for a typical European financial institution in terms of their day-to-day compliance?
It creates enormous risk. Firms now have to prove proactively that they are not only looking out for their clients' crimes, but also ensuring their clients' legal counsel, financial advisors, or accountants are not inadvertently or deliberately aiding and abetting money laundering activities.
So due diligence now extends far beyond the client to their entire professional ecosystem.
It does. And the ambiguity around the scope of aiding and abetting forces a complete risk-averse compliance culture.
We also see liability extended from just the individual to the business entity itself.
That's right. Liability for money laundering is explicitly extended from individuals, say, the compliance officer or a rogue trader, to the business as a whole. This is crucial because it provides wider grounds for prosecution.
Specifically targeting what?
The failure to effectively prevent money laundering, and the penalties for corporate conviction are severe. Regulatory fines can explicitly reach up to 5 million euros, coupled with immense reputational damage, the loss of licenses, and even the potential for a court-mandated dissolution. The risk is now existential for major institutions.
Now let's talk about the expansion of the list of crimes that generate the dirty money, the 22 predicate offenses. This is where 6 AMLD really reflects the reality of 21st century crime.
Yes. Money laundering isn't a standalone crime. It requires underlying criminal activity to generate the funds. The directive formalizes 22 categories of these predicate offenses, including the classics like drug trafficking and human trafficking.
But two categories are entirely near to EU law.
And they reflect modern organized crime, the abuse of the natural environment, and cybercrime.
The abuse of the natural environment, what does that specifically cover, and why must a bank now screen for it?
This is a direct response to these massive, multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprises involving illegal logging, illegal mining, illegal wildlife trafficking, and the illicit disposal of toxic waste.
So a bank has to connect transaction monitoring to environmental crime.
For instance, yes, a bank must now screen transactions not just for drug money, but also for funds derived from, say, the illegal deforestation of rainforests. It demands a much broader scope of risk analysis than ever before.
And cybercrime, that's a huge, complex field.
It is. 6AMLD covers all crimes carried out through information systems. We're talking ransomware attacks, major data breaches, identity theft, cryptocurrency fraud.
So if a ransomware group demands payment and that money is filtered through a European institution,
That institution can be held liable for failure to prevent the laundering of proceeds from cybercrime. This requires firms to integrate intelligence on cyber threat actors directly into their AML screening systems.
finally, we need to look at jurisdiction extension, which was designed to close that border hopping loophole.
The directive expands liability significantly. It extends liability to individuals who are habitual residents of a member state, even if they aren't nationals.
And it can even apply if the crime happens outside the EU?
In certain cases, yes, provided the perpetrator is an EU national or the crime harms the EU. The message is crystal clear. You cannot escape liability simply by hopping across a border or structuring your crime in a third country if you have deep ties to an EU member state.
For firms trying to comply with these massive legal shifts, this isn't just about updating a policy manual. This requires a full overhaul of their operational infrastructure.
It does, and the foundation, as always, must be the Enterprise-Wide Risk Assessment, or EWRA.
And that can't be a static document.
No, it has to be fully auditable and dynamically updated. With 6AMLD, the EWRA needs to specifically assess how the firm is exposed to the new 22 predicate offenses. For instance, if they have clients in sectors vulnerable to illegal logging or ransomware payments.
Beyond the assessment, how must firms adjust their internal governance?
Governance and policy must be revised to ensure radical transparency. Senior managers have to have clear lines of accountability, and those lines must be traceable when an incident occurs.
So if a senior manager is found to have tolerated poor compliance,
The liability is explicitly on them and the firm.
staff training must now be a vital line of defense, especially with these new crime categories.
Staff awareness is now mission critical. Training needs to go way beyond the basics of money laundering. Employees must fully understand the new typologies, particularly around environmental abuse and cybercrime, because ignorance is explicitly no longer an excuse.
And this focus extends to vendor risk management.
Meaning, firms have to do due diligence on their own suppliers.
Exactly. If a bank hires an accounting firm, and that accounting firm is found to be aiding a client in money laundering, the bank could potentially face liability under 6AMLD for failing to adequately manage its vendor risk.
So they have to use advanced tools, like adverse media screening, on their own third-party suppliers.
Yes, to detect any red flags or negative news that might indicate a compliance failure on the vendor side.
And finally, all this new data and awareness has to be implemented into the technology that handles the transactions.
The AML platforms, the screening and monitoring systems, they require significant and costly reconfiguration.
They need to be tuned to detect the new range of predicate risks and the higher demands of sanctions evasion scrutiny. For example, transaction monitoring algorithms have to be adapted to spot unusual cash flows consistent with illegal waste dumping or the purchasing patterns associated with the black market wildlife trade.
And the directive stresses that processes must be flexible.
Agile and ready for future changes because this regulatory tightening is a continuous process.
Looking at the trajectory beyond 6AMLD, is the EU done? Or is this just the latest step in a much longer, tougher path?
This is absolutely not the end. The regulatory trajectory is only moving one way, towards greater harmonization and centralized enforcement.
So more changes are likely.
Highly anticipated, including the likely introduction of a central EU AML agency. This agency would be empowered to directly police compliance at an institutional level across the Union, bypassing the slow national processes that have historically allowed these leaks and scandals to flourish.
But not all of Europe is following the exact 6AMLD template, which shows how fragile harmonization can be.
That's an important nuance. The United Kingdom, for instance, chose not to incorporate 6AMLD into its national law post-Brexit.
And their reasoning.
Their assessment was that their existing legislation, specifically the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, already matched or exceeded the requirements of the directive.
But they're still moving in the same direction.
Yes, the UK is still actively discussing introducing a general failure to prevent economic crime offense, which shows that even outside the EU, the vector of increasing corporate liability remains constant.
And some EU nations are going even further than the directive mandates?
Yes. Germany is a prime example. They've adopted an even tougher national approach, specifically adopting a broader definition of money laundering that covers all serious financial crime as predicate offenses, not just the 22 listed in 6AMLD.
Which creates a challenging and still uneven environment for businesses.
It does. It requires them to comply with the highest possible standard, which in many cases is now the German standard.
So let's synthesize the journey we've taken. Our deep dive into the Panama Papers and the subsequent leaks confirms that the exposure revealed a pervasive, systemic flaw.
And that flaw was enabled by a network of professional secrecy providers like Mossack Fonseca, and it was protected by hopelessly outdated, inconsistent cross-border legal frameworks.
The counteroffensive, best exemplified by the EU's 6AMLD, represents a radical shift. It's a push for rigorous harmonization, a massive widening of criminal liability to include businesses and professional collaborators.
And a necessary expansion of the definition of predicate offenses to include the modern face of organized crime, like environmental abuse and sophisticated cybercrime.
And the measurable recovery of that $1.36 billion provides concrete evidence that increased transparency isn't just an ideal.
No, it yields tangible financial returns that benefit public funds.
However, the challenge persists. As long as secrecy mechanisms are structurally permitted in high-prestige jurisdictions, especially these increasingly popular onshore havens like certain U.S. states, the illicit capital will just continue its search for shelter.
It becomes a game of musical chairs, doesn't it? If the system isn't fundamentally reformed worldwide, there's just another Panama waiting to happen, but relocated to a more exclusive address.
The source material leaves us with a critical thought that goes beyond just economic justice. Financial secrecy enables more than just tax evasion.
It facilitates disinformation campaigns, which corrupt actors then weaponize to destabilize entire societies and undermine democracy itself.
And that raises an important question for you to consider. If hidden financial flows complicate efforts to trace corruption by obscuring who is funding massive disinformation campaigns, funding political interference, and manipulating public opinion, what vital and non-negotiable role does mandated financial transparency play, not just in securing public money and economic justice, but in securing global democratic integrity against manipulation and subversion?
Something to think about until the next deep dive.